Hi, this is John Romano, and I'm recording this lecture, Later Africa, for my course, World Civilization to 1500. And in this lecture, we're going to be picking up from where we left off in the first lecture about Africa. And so we're going to cover the period from around the year 1000 to around the year 1500. And during the earlier period in African history we studied, we said that one of the most dramatic occurrences was something known as the Bantu migrations. And we had said that these Bantu peoples, all of whom spoke a similar language, would end up moving to many of the territories of southern Africa. And what we're going to see is that as they arrive in these different parts of southern Africa, they are going to begin to settle down and begin to practice some of the settled agriculture, something that had already been accustomed to in their homeland, but they're going to bring it with them. And we're going to see as they get to these places all sorts of rising population that comes with settled agriculture, really at the expense of some of the peoples who had once dwelled in these areas in Africa. And we're going to see, in addition to the calories that were entering into people's diets, simply as the result of the settled agriculture that was already present in Africa, we're also going to see a new crop begin to enter Africa, and specifically from what today is modern day Indonesia. And Indonesians are going to travel to Madagascar, and some of their goods are going to also begin to get into the mainland in Africa. And these Indonesians in particular are going to really bring something that is going to really change the agricultural fortunes of Africa entirely, and these are bananas. Initially, again, domesticated in Southeast Asia, and through these sea trips, these sea journeys, they're going to be introduced into Africa as well. I'll just give you a moment to stare at these bananas. This is actually the way that bananas grow in nature, in case you were curious. And because this is likely the only thing you'll remember about the entire lecture, I'll give you just a second to stare at the bananas. In any case, you may wonder, okay, who cares about bananas? Well, bananas actually end up proving to be a very important crop for Africa because really bananas can grow even in areas that tend already to be heavily forested, meaning that you didn't have to first clear forest to be able to plant them. And so, in essence, this is going to allow for a more enriched diet for the people of Africa. And in fact, even going to help this process by which the Bantu peoples expand further, and really their population grows up even further. We do not tend to think that most of these areas, now populated by Bantu peoples, are initially going to have very complex forms of government. I mean, they don't have very elaborate officials. They don't have a bureaucracy to be able to run affairs. We tend to think for long periods that most of these family and kinship groups are the people who are really important. I mean, those are the institutions that are important to Africans among the Bantu peoples. Many of fathers are going to serve as major patriarchs or chiefs. So there's really no need for very complex government in the beginning. What we're going to see starting from around the year 1000 is these kind of Bantu societies, of which really kin was the most important thing, are going to start to face new challenges. And in effect, they're going to be too successful for their own good in some ways. Population growth is going to increase to such a degree that it actually will strain the resources available to these peoples. And unlike in the past, during the course of the Bantu migrations, where it always seemed that there was one new area to be able to go to turn to, that is not going to be the case any longer. New migrants had nowhere else to settle, and these kind of stresses are going to end up causing conflicts between different villages as they now begin to fight out who gets access to the best agricultural land. And these kinds of conflicts are going to end up causing a much greater militarization of some of these areas. And in fact, with militarization, we're also going to see much more formal structures of government beginning to turn up. In fact, the government is going to begin to resemble more a military-style government. And rather now than simply rely on powerful fathers or patriarchs, increasingly now people are going to have to depend upon powerful chiefs, generals, people who could leave them in battle. And in fact, very often these generals would actually override old familial groups. It's going to become much more important in a time of war that you have someone competent to be able to lead you. Some of these generals also manage to consolidate the territory under their control and begin to form small kingdoms. And really, it's not only in the Manchu regions. In fact, this is going to be a trend that becomes very general throughout sub-Saharan Africa after around 1000, where you see now militarized small kingdoms growing up. To provide one example of this trend, we'll look at the Kingdom of Benin that is founded around this time period in the forested regions of West Africa here. This area, this city-state really, because it's really centered around Benin City here, you're going to see that there is a court surrounded by a ruler, and those who live in the urban region who surround the countryside around it. Really, most important in this calculus is the ruler, the general, known as an Oba, which we might translate simply as king. I should say that the Oba is going to be powerful, but he's not going to stand head and shoulders over other leading figures in society. He's still going to have to play nice with them, in essence. And in fact, many other powerful families are always going to attempt to take power away from him. As in other places we've seen, the Oba is a good example of a military figure who helps to lead wars of expansion in the region to be able to bring more territory under Benin. And in addition to, we also think that the Oba is going to have a religious ritual significance. He's actually going to, for instance, carry out certain rituals, like, for instance, sacrificing slaves to be able to benefit this kingdom. One of the reasons, again, I could have chosen other kingdoms as an example, but one of the reasons why researchers have always been fascinated by Benin is that we have these wonderful wonderful pieces of art, very often brass sculpture, preserved from Benin, that really give us this fantastic glimpse into what at least some people in the society look like. You're really just, in some sense, a snapshot of some of the human faces who lived in this kingdom. And again, you can see here very often showing people who or dressed up in military gear, because this was a highly militarized society. You can see again very often weapons, shields, things of this nature. Um, Again, some of these are really very detailed. Some of them show what we imagine. Again, here's a head that is carved out of ivory. Um, some of them appear to show scenes drawn from their legends and history. Unfortunately, at the current state of our understanding, we are often not able to identify exactly who is depicted often in these bronzes or other images. And we can often decode some of the legends and what they're supposed to mean. And at least one of the reasons for this was that during the time of the British Empire, they were taken from this region and brought to London, so ripped out of their natural context. Although to this day, there are still many who would like to see them repatriated. Another of the very active regions where we begin to see very interesting political development as well is right here on the west coast of Africa, where we see this really very interesting development right around the basin of the Congo River. And really, we're going to see first, as we've seen elsewhere, a series of wars that eventually will lead to a fairly stable kingdom that is really larger than any of them, sometimes referred to as the Kingdom of the Congo. And at least one of the reasons why this continues to be a very central kingdom is that its location. Because it is located along the coast, it begins to become a participant in trade networks involving precious metals like copper, cloth, and actually shells as well. And we're going to see that the Kingdom of Congo is going to have a very strongly centralized government with a king like this one at the top of the government, and also a series of officials, kind of like cabinet members, some of whom oversaw military affairs, some judicial affairs, some financial affairs. The king is also, in addition to be able to hire these people, he will also have governors who rule over the various regions of the Kingdom of the Congo. And each of these also will have all sorts of subordinate officials that will serve under them. And all of these are really very tightly organized underneath the power of the king. And really, in some ways, some people would say that of the kingdoms that emerged from the Bantu peoples, this was the most tightly organized and run. And really, at least some of the efficiency derives from the fact that the king itself can appoint or replace local officials at will. And has a lot of power as well over their military. Again, so that role as a general as well. One of the very interesting facts about the Kingdom of Congo was that its central government maintained its own currency, but they did not develop a currency as elsewhere based upon coinage. Instead, they had a system of currency that was based upon these things, cowries. And these are actually seashells, beautiful seashells, that, as you can see, were burnished so they shone. And these come from the area around the Indian Ocean. And it should just probably reinforce the idea that currency really is a shared agreement just to take something for payment. There really is nothing inherently valuable about these seashells. But then again, there's nothing inherently valuable about gold and silver. It's just that people like these things as well. Altogether, the Kingdom of the Congo will be a very successful kingdom, and it will actually exist until the mid 17th century, so beyond the period that we're studying in this class. But the great problem that they're going to run into is when certain Europeans, especially the Portuguese, begin to come in large numbers, and they begin to engage in the slave trade. This will completely undermine the authority of the Kingdom of the Congo, and in essence, help to unravel this kingdom entirely. While we're focusing on the sort of western part of Africa, it's fair to note that in some of the same regions that we've already spoken about, that the Muslim traders come from North Africa. That in fact, this Muslim presence is going to continue over time, and really in this slightly later period, for exactly the same reasons why Muslim traders had come to Western Africa in an earlier period. They want to get ivory. They want to get salt. They want to get precious metals, other exotic local items that come from animals, all of these reasons. And so really Muslims continue to make the journey across the Sahara Desert to be able to reach areas of Western Africa. The most significant of these kingdoms that becomes very important for these Muslim traders is this area in green here known as the Mali Empire. And again, those of you remember from last time that this is actually in this same position, and in fact, the successor state to the Ghana Empire that we previously had discussed. And it's actually even larger than the Ghana Empire had been previously, absorbs more regions. And you'll notice, by the way, that Timbuktu is actually a city within the Mali Empire. It is indeed a real place. This Mali Empire was in particularly promoted by Sunjata, pictured in a modern rendition here, the so-called Lion Prince. And Sunjata, actually, before he comes to power in Mali, he actually suffers a period of exile where he's forced outside of his homeland. But while he's outside of it, he makes all sorts of alliances with other rulers. He gains a reputation for courage in battle, and he actually manages to assemble for himself a large army that is dominated by cavalry, by horse soldiers. After this point, Sunjata will return home and then take charge of the Mali Empire himself. And one of the reasons I'm pointing out Sunjata in particular was that there actually will be a later epic that will be written about his exploits that becomes very popular, which takes a lot of creative license probably with his life, but essentially tells this story of his coming home to reclaim power after exile. We think that Sunjata will say that in effect there are many different people who have some sort of power, chieftains who live in the Mali Empire, but from his point on, there could be only one Mansa, and this term Mansa means something like emperor in the realm. One of the real benefits of the Mali Empire was that they really benefit handsomely from this kind of trans-Saharan trade I've discussed. And in effect, as time goes on, they're recognizing the value of this trade, They even begin to bring other crops to market. Think about, for instance, beans, rice, and cotton. The benefit is that the Mali Empire, by carefully controlling this trade from Muslim regions and taxing all of these merchants, really means that they're able to make a lot of money as long as the caravans of merchants come through. And the caravans, we're told, really come in enormous numbers. We said, for instance, there are caravans with as many as 25,000 camels that will pour into the Mali Empire all at once. And in particular, merchants seeking to enter the gold trade will often come in this region. Well, what we'll see is as these people begin to pour into the Mali Empire, buildings of brick and stone begin to go up. There's a lot more money circulating around. Also, we see that the rulers of Mali are careful to cultivate these Muslim traders by making them feel at home. They, of course, offered, for instance, lodging and protection for these traders because they needed them. But they gave all sorts of, let's say, comforts of home. And in many cases, too, the rulers will actually choose, and some of the elite people will choose to convert to Islam. And I should say that this does not lead to a wide-scale conversion to Islam all at once. So they encouraged the spread of Islam among its peoples, but the Mali Emperor will never demand it. And here I'm showing you a picture of the Great Mosque that is built in the Mali Empire. Portions of which, I should say, have been rebuilt since this period, but the core of which actually goes up, and specifically goes up to give these Muslim merchants a place to worship where they're away from home. And again, some of these elite peoples within the Mali Empire who do convert. Some people would say that the significance of, first of all, trade and the presence of Islam within the Mali Empire becomes clear during the reign of Sunjata's grandson, Mansa Musa. So Musa is his given name. Mansa is, again, this title, emperor. And here is a map that, in essence, shows that all trade routes basically lead to Mali Empire at the time. And created at this time specifically because this was the high point of the empire by far. And again, within this map, you can see this is Mansa Musa himself. And very clearly, looking at this image, you can see what the basis of his power was. Again, he has a gold coin on him, he has a crown, and he has a scepter. Again, both of the crown and the scepter, of course, also made of gold. One of really the chief products that they brought to market. Mansa Musa really grows up in a Muslim family, and we really think that he takes his faith quite seriously. And one of the ways we can see this is he actually ends up doing what all Muslims who had the ability to do so were supposed to do, making the once-in-a-lifetime pilgrimage to the holy city of Mecca. But Mansa Musa, when he did this, did not do it just like any pilgrim. He decided to do it in imperial style. And supposedly he sets off in a caravan of thousands, soldiers, attendants, his subjects, slaves. He also, as part of this pilgrimage, he does what another of the things that good Muslims are supposed to do. He he decided that he was going to hand out alms, hand out charity to people along the way. And again, he really does this at an imperial style. He supposedly just has hundreds of camels meant to carry gold, and along the way, he will just lavish all sorts of gifts on his hosts. Um, Supposedly, he distributes so much gold in the Egyptian city of Cairo that he floods the market and causes the price of gold to begin to drop. And we think that when Mansa Musa arrives in Mecca, like many Muslims who had grown up outside of the core regions of Islam, when he actually gets into contact with Muslims from these sort of much more traditional core areas of Islam, he learns more about the faith, and he begins to take his religion even more seriously than before. And he pours money into, for instance, building more mosques and wanting to really sponsor education, Muslim-style education, for which, again, the Muslim world had become famous. He wanted to bring that to the Mali Empire. And he actually begins to make offers to certain professors who lived, for instance, in North Africa, and ask them now to come to the Mali Empire to begin to do their work. And really, we can see still in the Mali Empire, there are some of the manuscripts that are the fruits of the labors of some of these professors who did work during this period. As you can see, not all of them are necessarily well taken care of, but they certainly are still present there. Unfortunately, after Mansa Musa's reign, what we see is a decline in the Mali Empire. Factions begin to grow up in the central government, which will basically cripple its operation. And we'll also begin to see that individual areas of the empire will begin to break off with the paralyzation of the central government. And really, the danger here is that all of these individual areas become much weaker, and nomadic groups begin to attack them, and in effect begin to really help to hasten the decline of the Mali Empire. Now, up until this point, we've mainly been speaking about the west coast of Africa, but in essence, we're also going to see simultaneously with some of the trends I've been talking about, the east coast of Africa is also going to become a really a lively zone for trade as well. And again, I had already mentioned to you that traders are coming from the area of what today is modern-day Indonesia. But in effect, even long before this period, the east coast of Africa had been on the map of many different peoples. We know, for instance, that sailors, for instance, from the Indian Empire, from Persia, from Greece, from Rome, all of these at one time or another had actually ended up coming to the east coast of Africa with the intention of trading. We think, however, that many of these early visitors really had very limited opportunities to trade. Because really at the time they had come previously, most of these East African populations tended to live from hunting and gathering, and especially along the coast, by fishing. And what this meant was is that although these traders, foreign traders, would come there, they wouldn't necessarily always find stable bodies to trade with, or really be able to find the right areas to get the items that they wanted to. So it was frustration on their part when they arrived. On the east coast of Africa, too, though, as the Bantu peoples begin to spread and their population begins to go up, what we're going to see is that they're going to begin to establish really much stronger settlements on the coasts and in the offshore islands of East Africa. And really, these peoples who now begin to settle down, do agriculture, fish, and trade are going to be the builders of what is known as Swahili society. And interestingly enough, Swahili is going to be a term from the Arabic language, which simply means those who live on the coast, coastal dwellers. And specifically, it is meant to refer to the dwellers of the East African coast. And Swahili actually is one of the many languages, the roots of which start in the Bantu tongue that we talked about. But it's just as the title, Swahili, which is actually Arabic, would indicate, all sorts of words begin to pour into the Bantu language from the Arabic language. And so really, Swahili will refer to the society, but Swahili actually is going to also refer to this language that people speak up and down the east coast of Africa. And these Swahili peoples will develop different dialects, but they will be mutually intelligible to one another. They'll be able to, in fact, communicate readily with one another. And again, there's going to be enough Arabic loan words that they're certainly going to be able to communicate with, especially initially, some of these Arabic traders who would come. And we're going to see as a whole that the society along the east coast of Africa is going to begin to have really a very similar kind of pattern with language, with religion, with architecture, with technology. Now, especially starting from the period we're talking from today, around the millennium, Muslim merchants are going to begin to more intensively get in contact with Swahili society, and really, again, from a much more settled position, these Swahili merchants are going to then begin to organize networks to get some of the things that were could be sold further on from the interior regions of Africa. Items, again, that are going to sound similar to you from what we've seen on the other coast. Things like, for instance, gold, other precious metals, ivory, sometimes exotic local products like, for instance, tortoise shells, leopard skins, things that essentially at the time one could only get in Africa. And these people then would trade for things that came from outside of Africa, like, for instance, pottery, glass, certain textiles. And some of these things were produced directly in Muslim territories, but Muslim merchants at this point really went all over the place. And sometimes they could bring items that were much farther afield, things that had come from Persia or India or China. What we're going to see is that the rapidly increasing volume and the value of the trade is going to have major repercussions for the Swahili states that grow up. And the biggest change is going to, again, be wealth. Wealth is going to begin to pour into East Africa. And really, what is the reason that for the wealth is simply that local chiefs will offer protection. They'll control the trade. They'll tax the trade, and through this, they'll actually strengthen their own authority as well. And really, as you'll see, a series of different convenient locations along the east coast of Africa beginning to grow up around the same time. The money is very clearly going to cause this very impressive transformation of some of the cities in East Africa. Cities like the name of Zanzibar are going to, for instance, really take on this air of this sort of undreamt of fortunes for the rest of the world. One of the simple ways you can see this transformation in the cities is now people are going to now, rather than as in the past, building in wood and dried mud, we're going to see now areas that begin to go up in stone. Is going to become much more important during this period. Here's just another example. And we're also going to see, for instance, especially public buildings are going to go up in stone. Mosques, again, houses of worship for Muslims too, are going to go up also on the east coast of Africa for similar reasons, and also built in stone. What we're going to see for a period of time is that merchants are going to, in time, become fabulously wealthy. We know that some of the ruling elites and merchants of the Swahili society will now be able to have things like silk from China, cotton clothes, porcelain, all of these things, perfumes and pearls from India. They're going to get copper coins for transactions, all of these things. To provide you just with one example, this is the island of Kilwa, which is off the coast of East Africa. And really, we think up until this point, this really until Swahili society becomes important, it was essentially going to be a teeny little fishing village. But really, as Swahili society begins to heat up economically, Kilwa is going to be transformed. And you can see there's going to be significant building in brick from really this teeny mud brick village that was dedicated to fishing. You're going to see now very wealthy merchants grow up practically overnight. And as I mentioned to you again, all the sort of again, porcelain from China now you can set your table with now, and Kilwa, and many other places along the east coast of Africa. And Kilwa and other places too, right along the coast, begin now. Previously, there was no need for any really kind of currency, but they could simply barter to be able to trade. At this point now, you begin to see people minting copper coinage to trade. So again, that's really a large change. We're also going to see that some regions are going now to begin to serve as the middlemen to bring the sort of goods to market. And that is especially true of this complex located roughly in central South Africa, this area known as Great Zimbabwe. From what we know previously, this area, Great Zimbabwe, had previously only been known for wooden residences. But in this period here, this great stone structure that I'm showing you here begins to grow up. Initially, when some of the Europeans who discovered the structure, they tended to be fairly racist and They just could not imagine that African natives could have constructed it. So they had to come up with these elaborate scenarios by which some outsider had to have come to build it. These days, no one doubts these are native Africans who created this major circular structure and many of the other buildings that once existed around it. And now we know too what it was good for. And that is because Great Zimbabwe is going to become the middleman for much of the trade on the east coast of Africa. There's going to be a king here who will oversee a very complicated structure of peoples meant to bring all of these goods further to market on the east coast. And supposedly as many as 18,000 people will live in and around this stone complex at its height. And really, it was the king's job to, again, to get these goods there, to tax them, and then make sure they made it to the coast. So you see all these allegiances growing up between the king of Great Zimbabwe and some of the traders on the east coast of Africa, who are the ones who are actually doing the trading rather than supplying. And you can see what money does. This stone structure is very complicated in some ways. I have all these sort of thick walls, these stone towers, these really sort of palace that once existed. And one interesting fact too about the walls, it may not be clear from just looking at it, they were so well constructed that in fact no mortar was necessary to hold together the stones, kind of like a Lego construction of some kind. And we're going to see in essence that probably just by the building themselves at Great Zimbabwe, there would initially have been a huge amount of money by the time that it was systematically really examined. There wasn't much else left. This is just one of the items that was left behind. Maybe give some of the hint of how rich it used to be there. I should say before I move on, as in East Africa, just as on the west coast of Africa, we think that many ruling elites would choose to convert to Islam, which really, again, was probably seen as a way to lay the basis for this kind of cultural exchange with Muslim merchants. But again, this was not a question ever of forced conversions. Islam had a position of a certain status among people, but we don't think, just as on the west coast of Africa, that there was never this mass conversions, and many people will continue to practice their native traditions, or in some cases there were mixtures between some Muslim beliefs and some native practices together. The last subject I wanted to deal a little bit with, I've really held off on this to the end, is a question of slavery. And again, as much as we may hate to say it, this really does become one of the major things that is being brought to market. Obviously not a thing at all, but certainly something that plays a large part in this economy. Now, it's important to note that slavery was nothing new in this period we're studying today. In fact, as far back as we can see, slavery does play a part in Africa, from a remote antiquity. And really, the reasons why people would become slaves in Africa were in some ways really not much different from the reason people become slaves in other places. Sometimes they become slaves as the result of being captives in war. In some cases, people would sell themselves into slavery because their family was in debt. In other cases, people would be made slaves because they have been found guilty of being criminals, in some cases, specifically often with women, because they were suspected of being witches. And so, as horrible as it may sound to us, slaves were actually often considered an important form of wealth in sub-Saharan Africa. Now, as trade with the Muslim world begins to increase, both on the west and on the east coast of Africa, one of the things that many of these Muslim merchants were asking for was slaves. And these, for instance, are clamps that were used to help transport slaves. And we know, in effect, that Muslim merchants really were perennially in need for more hands to be able to do labor, especially any dirty labor that people didn't want to do themselves. We know, in fact, even at some points when the government was relatively weak, they would even go to Western Europe too to be able to get certain slaves. But really, increasingly, the area where many Muslim merchants are going to turn to is Africa. And in fact, we're going to see markets beginning to pop up in areas of the Muslim world. Here's just one manuscript illumination that shows African slaves being sold in Islam. And really, this outer sort of need and this sort of a demand for slaves really is going to mean that slave trading actually is going to become far more prominent within Africa than it had ever been previous to this. In fact, it's actually going to lead in some cases rulers of certain African states to begin to make war on smaller states, not only for land, but specifically to go to war in search of captives that then could be brought to slave markets because of just how much money they were bringing in. And we think that, in fact, the slave trade numerically becomes really huge. In some years, as many as between 10 and 20,000 Africans will leave their homeland as slaves. And really, it would at some point really have become an important feature of many Muslim areas that slaves from Africa were simply a common sight. Although we do know that the conditions under which they were treated were so bad that there actually were more than one revolt against Muslim rulers, really led by African slaves. The Muslim slave trade was quite a big affair. Perhaps in the period we're talking to today, really, there's probably as many as 10 million people will ultimately leave Africa for the Muslim territories. And what we're going to see is that this is really going to create a series of networks within Africa, again, that will supply slaves on a regular basis to foreigners. And so what ends up going to happen later on is that in later Muslim merchants will end up getting out of the game of the slave trade, but instead both Western Europeans and Americans will begin, in many cases, to take over the exact same slave networks that had already existed, and in fact, actually build them up to an even greater degree. So more slaves were then leading Africa. But again, the idea of providing slaves and the networks themselves already existed, again, from the period that we're discussing here today. All right, that's it. Thank you.